All right. So today we're going to be talking about substantial improvement and substantial damage. I use the acronym SISD a lot because sometimes I get tired of saying substantial improvement and substantial damage. So you'll be seeing that throughout the slides. And I'll probably be using those acronyms here and there throughout the program as well. All right. So this is the training agenda for today. We'll be going over some of the definitions and regulations, some building scenarios, the determination process, administrative procedures and resources, and additional resources and wrap up. And we'll plan to end at 3:30 today. All right, so the training objectives for today: provide an understanding of those definitions, regulations, and the determination process for substantial improvement, substantial damage. Discussions show examples of those building scenarios that we'll walk through. Provide some tips, best practices, and resources. And now, question for you all. What is your familiarity with substantial improvement and substantial damage? I have a poll here. Let me launch that. All right. So if you go into the chat function, you should be able to find that poll in your chat, and you should be able to vote on that. I just wanted to get an understanding of what kind of experience everybody has had with substantial improvement and substantial damage. If for some reason you don't see it in the chat or you can't vote for some reason, feel free just to put the letter of the answer here in the chat, and that will work as well. Kim, do you have a question?
How do I unmute?
What's that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Kim.
For some reason, I don't have access to the chat. It's saying we're having trouble loading your messages. Try refreshing. I've tried refreshing, and I can't get the chat feature to work.
Okay.
I'll take down my hand now.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what that is. If anyone else is having that issue, let me know. All right. So where we're at is it looks like we have 66% have some familiarity. 25% it's new to me, and we have 8% or one person that's very familiar. So that's very helpful. It seems to be kind of down the middle of the road there. So thank you for that. I will close that. And we'll get back to the presentation. All right, so because substantial improvement and substantial damage are part of the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program, we'll have to talk a little bit about that just to get us started talking about this. So the NFIP is a voluntary partnership between FEMA and participating communities. Here in New Hampshire, we have 200 communities that do participate in the program. So the parts of the NFIP, there's 3 parts of it, and they really overlap a lot. And we'll be talking a little bit about that as we talk about it during the presentation. So it's knowing your risk, which is about the floodplain mapping. So FEMA identifies and maps areas that are subject to flooding under certain conditions. Then there's reducing your risk, which is establishing minimum criteria for development in identified flood-prone areas. And lastly, there's ensuring your risk. FEMA underwrites flood insurance coverage through the National Flood Insurance Program. So the substantial improvement and substantial damage is a piece of reducing your risk. It's under the floodplain regulations. It's contained in every community that participates in their floodplain ordinance. All right. So to get started, we have to understand about the types of buildings that are in the community and how they relate to substantial improvement. So first of all, there's existing buildings. These buildings were built prior to the initial flood insurance rate map that was issued for a community. These are also known as pre-firm structures, which is pre-flood insurance rate map. This is also these houses are also built prior to any community floodplain regulations were in place. So it was before communities had joined the program. So in New Hampshire, initial flood insurance rate maps kind of range from the 1970s to up to 2000s. And generally, the initial flood insurance rate map and the date the community joined the NFIP are the same. So in this case, these existing homes, as you can see from the picture here, these homes would not account for the base flood elevation. The base flood elevation is that 1% chance flood of the height the water would get to during a 1% chance flood event. Since they didn't have any standards to build by, they just built wherever the land was without much recognition of what the flood risk was at the time because there were no maps. So these homes are the ones that have substantial improvement, substantial provisions that would apply if they met the criteria. The next set of buildings that you would find is new construction buildings. These are called post-firm buildings, post-flood insurance rate map buildings. So these homes were built when there was a FEMA map in place. It was after those initial flood insurance rate maps. It was also after the community has adopted their floodplain regulations. So in theory, those buildings should have been built in compliance at the time of the map that was in place and the regulations that are in place. So the substantial improvement and substantial provisions would apply if there's a new map that's been issued since that house was built, if there's been an increase in the base flood elevation since the house was built, or the community's floodplain regulations have changed. For example, some communities required that the lowest floor be elevated to at least the minimum requirement of at or above the base flood elevation. Many communities now enforce that the lowest floor has to be elevated at least 1 or 2 feet or more above the base flood elevation. So that's an important information to know about these new construction buildings, because even though they were built at that time, things could have changed and they may need to be going up depending on certain circumstances. And we'll be kind of going through this in that building scenario part of the presentation. All right, so the intent of the substantial improvement and substantial damage provisions is really to identify a threshold of investment above which improvements need to be done in a stronger, safer, smarter way. It also provides an opportunity to reduce or eliminate future costs and damages for existing structures. And it provides an opportunity to break the cycle of disaster damage, reconstruction, and repeated damage. There are 2 main FEMA resources that are great places to go if you have questions or need more information about substantial improvement and substantial damage. First, there's the Substantial Improvement Desk Reference. This is the resource that I used a lot. Anytime I got questions about substantial improvement, substantial damage, I would be going to this. Even though it's dated 2010, it's still useful. It's still applicable. It's got a lot of great information in it. In 2018, FEMA updated their answer to questions about substantial improvement, substantial damage buildings. This references the DES reference a lot. But it's in a question and answer format. So if you have a particular question, sometimes you can find that question directly in this resource and find that answer in there. So most of the information that I'm presenting today comes from these sources. So I just wanted to highlight them as I go through this. So you know that this is a place where you can go to find out more information. In addition, I'm going to be sending up a follow-up email to everybody that registered for this training. I will include the slides as well as a training resource page, which will include all the resources that I talk about during the training. And one resource that I just recognized that I forgot to mention is when you're looking for that initial flood insurance rate map that determines whether or not a building is considered an existing building or a new construction building, I'll be sending the link to the FEMA Community Status Book, which includes that date. So you'll have that as well. All right, so what is the definition of substantial improvement? Substantial improvement means any reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or other improvement of a structure, the cost of which equal or greater than 50% of the market value of the structure before the start of construction, which is a term defined in the ordinance, of the improvement, and includes structures which have incurred substantial damage regardless of the actual repair performed. So I've had questions in the past of why is it 50%? And that was really chosen as a compromise between two extremes. One extreme would be to prohibit all investment in existing non-conforming buildings that do not meet the minimum NFIP requirements. The other extreme would be to allow buildings in flood hazard areas to be improved in any fashion without regard to flood risk. So that is where we come about. That's where they came about with the 50%, which a lot of people call the 50% rule. The term of substantial improvement does not, however, include either of the following. Any project to correct existing violations of state, local safety code or specifications by local code enforcement official. So to be excluded, the cost must be the minimum necessary to correct a violation or condition that predates the application and was previously cited by an official who has authority to enforce the community's health and sanitary and safety codes. So this is not something that's going to be found at the time of the substantial improvement determination. It should have been already documented as an issue prior. The other exemption is regarding historic structures. Any alteration of a historic structure, provided that the structure will not preclude the structure's continued designation as a historic structure. So again, the community's floodplain ordinance defines the criteria for what is a historic structure, which is usually on a state federal register. So those do not have to meet the substantial improvement requirements. There is a great FEMA guidance document about historic structures, and it goes more into these details about this exemption and then what can be done with historic structures. Okay, some examples of substantial improvement examples. Rehabilitation or remodeling of a structure with or without modifying the external dimensions. So if you have a structure that gets torn down, but the footprint of the foundation remains the same and you just build new on it, that is considered a substantial improvement. Lateral additions that may or may not involve structural modifications of the load-bearing structure of the existing structure. This is an example we'll be going through during the building scenarios later in the presentation. Vertical additions, repair, replacement of foundations, including extending existing foundations, repair of damage of any origin that is necessary to restore a structure to its pre-damage condition, work on structures that were compliant at the time of construction. Again, it's one of those where you have a new construction building that either the flood zone change, the base flood elevation change, or the floodplain regulations of the community had changed. All right, so we're going to substantial damage definition now. So substantial damage means damage of any origin sustained by a structure, whereby the cost of restoring the structure is equal to or greater than 50% of the market value of the structure before the damage occurred. Now, there's no exemptions regarding substantial damage, although substantial damage and substantial improvement are intertwined. So if you do have, for example, a damage to a historic structure, that exemption is still in place. So some substantial damage examples include, this is reference to the fact that substantial damage definition says damage of any origin. A lot of times it gets confusing because it's a part of a floodplain ordinance that it's only because of a flood. But it can be of any origin, whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made event. Flood, tornado, wind, house fire, a burst pipe. Some of these on the list are ones that I actually have dealt with in the past. We had the tornado that went through New Hampshire in 2007. As you may recall, it went around Northwood Lake. Some of the homes that are around Northwood Lake were damaged as a result because they were in the floodplain of Northwood Lake. I did some outreach with the town of Northwood to remind them of the substantial damage requirements. Okay, so the provisions that are in a floodplain ordinance for a community that participates, this language comes from the Code of Federal Regulations, which a lot of communities have adopted over time. It requires that all new construction and substantial improvements of residential structures within Zone A's on the community's farm have the lowest floor, including basement, elevated to or above the base flood elevation. That's the minimum standard established under the NFIP. The one thing that I learned with this language is it really doesn't highlight the fact of substantial damage. The only way you can link substantial improvement to substantial damage is by looking at the definition of substantial improvement, and it has that reference to substantial damage. And then you can go to the definition of substantial damage. But in case nobody goes to the definition, you don't necessarily see it, and so sometimes it can be out of mind. One thing that I did when I updated the state's model higher standards model ordinance is I specifically put substantial damage into the ordinance language itself so that it's not only seeing in substantially improved, but substantially damaged as well. The other thing that I want to highlight in here is that I also put 1 foot above base flood elevation. So this is just a reminder that our state building code as of 2015 did require that all structures in a special flood hazard area should be elevated at or above, 1 foot above base flood elevation. So just a reminder on that. And in addition, the state building code that we have now, which references the 2021 I codes, does have these same substantial improvement, substantial damage provisions in the code as well. And in those provisions, they specifically call out substantial damage in the regulations, as well as substantial improvement. All right. So when a When a structure is determined to be substantially improved or substantially damaged, they must be brought into compliance with requirements in your community ordinance as if it was new construction. So what does a compliant residential structure look like? So this is an example of a new construction in a zone AE. And what we have here is you need to have the lowest floor at or above that base flood elevation. And there's certain things that you can do to help elevate this. This house is built on a full foundation system, which you are allowed to do to get that lowest floor at or above that base flood elevation. In addition, there's a couple other things that have to happen to make this enclosure compliant. It has to have the required number of flood openings in the enclosure walls. It can only be used for parking, access, or storage. And the floor of that enclosure has to be at grade on at least one side. And in this case, this space is being used as a garage. It has the float openings, and it's at it moves the lowest floor up to that base flood elevation. This is an example of a new construction zone VE. You have wave action in zone VE, so there are different standards. You cannot have full foundation walls in VEs because of that increased velocity. So you have to elevate on piers, post piers and columns, which is an example here. This is an example of a house in Allenstown that was damaged as a result of the 2006 or 2007 floods. It had been at grade and then it had to be elevated because it needed to get up to that base flood elevation, that lowest floor. So they lifted it up, put a new foundation system underneath it, and is now being used as a garage. It has the flood openings, it has that floor above that base flood elevation, and the floor of the enclosure is at grade on at least one side. So just a note, basements, as defined by the National Flood Insurance Program, is an area below grade on all sides, and those basements are considered the lowest floor. So if you are doing a new construction or substantial improvement, there should be no basement. There should be nothing that's below grade on all sides on a structure. There's also requirements for utility systems, such as the elevation of air conditioning units should be elevated, and there should be use of flood damage resistant materials. So there's specific requirements in the ordinances that vary by A zones and B zones, but that's just kind of a highlight just as we move on and talk further about bringing these homes into compliance. Shanti, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a quick question that has to do with the historic exemption.
Yep.
We're not qualifying if if it can be maintained as a historic building even after the work has been performed, then it's not subject to the same restrictions as would be, and this is from the International Existing Building Code, but it looks like it lines up with what you said earlier. So
Yep.
the question is, because we have a historic building that we're working with near the water, and they want to put an addition on, and it would be less. The cost of it would, in fact, be less than 50% of the market value, but it would also maintain its designation as a historic building, regardless of the cost of construction. So we're at this gray area. We think it's a gray area. Hopefully you can answer. Is with respect to their floor will be at elevation 8, whereas we would want them to be a foot above elevation 9. And they may or may not be able to do that. But given this section for exemption on historic, would they even be required to? Could they put an addition on and not comply with the elevation requirements because it'll be historic building before and after?
That is a good question. I'm questioning, I'm thinking in my head about the addition part. That's kind of stumping me. Usually I've dealt with like interior improvements to a historic structure, but the addition piece, My thought is that exemption still remains in place, but I would want to follow up on with you on that because the addition piece is an interesting question about that.
Yeah, and actually it is it's a closed-in porch right now, but what they'd like to do is turn it into a three-season room with a roof deck. So the footprint
Okay.
wouldn't change, but in
The
order to do what they'd like to do, it would involve a brand new foundation. Everything's brand new, but it would just be
Mhm.
replaced for. So we can follow up later. That's fine. I don't want to take up this these folks' time, but I just figured if you had an answer, that would be great. So
Yeah, my initial thought is that the exemption would allow that to happen without them having to comply. And you said it's not a substantial improvement, or the cost won't be a substantial improvement anyway. So, um, but yeah,
right. So what's the limit? So now next year they do it again, and the year after that they do it again. It's like, eventually they've got this massive structure which is new within the last decade, but none of it complied, and it's still historic
yeah,
as long as our HTC approved it.
yeah. That's where I think I'm going to go to that historic guidance. I use that a lot when I was answering questions about this. So I will check on that and follow up with you. So
Thank
thank
you.
you for that
Appreciate it.
question. Yeah, and again, I should have mentioned if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat. I'm happy to answer along the way as we're going through things. Okay, so in addition to the minimum standards of the floodplain regulations regarding substantial improvement, substantial damage, there's a couple of higher standards that I just wanted to highlight. And this is kind of related to what Shanti just asked about is phased improvements. So there's no specific timeline that's referenced regarding, you know, what time frame somebody submits a permit to make improvements. The general time frame is a year, which aligns with a building permit time frame. But we know that property owners sometimes want to do phase improvements done in part with separate permits for each phase, or they want to split up improvement projects over time to get around the substantial improvement or substantial damage requirements. So communities have an option to modify their ordinance with a cumulative substantial improvement, substantial damage provision, which includes a set time frame. Usually it's 3, 5, or 10 years. So it's just what community is comfortable with. But knowing that the community needs to keep and maintain and check structure records each time improvements and/or repairs are required for that structure to ensure consistent enforcement of this higher standard. So in order to, and it's also a good practice also for communities should have detailed written procedures on how these improvements will be tracked cumulatively. Especially I've seen written procedures I've seen are very helpful for communities that have multiple people working on something like this, or in cases where a community official that's doing it has now leaves and you have someone coming in. Those procedures just make it an easy way to continue the consistency and fairness of making these determinations. So we do have two communities right now in New Hampshire that have adopted and enforced this higher standard. Newcastle was the first one. They have a 5-year period for both substantial improvement and substantial damage, and Rye followed them with the similar ordinance language in 2 years later in 2024. So one of the resources that I'm going to be sharing is a menu of higher floodplain standards that I helped the Office of Planning and Development update. I'll include a link to their website, and you'll find these more information about this higher standard as well as the ordinance language for both Newcastle and Rye. Okay, the other higher standard is a lower threshold for substantial improvement. This triggers the requirement for buildings to be brought into compliance at a lower percent threshold, lower than 50%, and helps bring that older buildings into compliance more quickly. So they adopt, usually the threshold is around 40 or 30% instead of 50%. And we currently have one community in the state that does enforce a lower threshold, which is the city of Portsmouth, which was done in the last couple of years. All right, so I'm going to attempt another poll. So you can look at that, and hopefully you can see that in your chat.
I still can't open my chat for some reason, Jennifer. Even though it's been a while since I closed it from our first poll.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I know you know this question, so.
I do know it, but I won't say it in case others are listening and they don't. All right. Thank you, though. Bye.
Yes. Thank you. All right, so we have a majority saying the municipality, and that is correct. I like to use that question because in the past that I have heard different versions of what that answer should be. So I'm glad to hear everybody is in agreement with the municipality is the one that enforces. So the substantial improvement, substantial damage requirements are in your local floodplain ordinance, which is adopted and enforced by the municipality. Great job. All right, so now we're going to go into some of those building scenarios that I talked about. So in this case, we have an existing structure in Zone A. The lowest floor is at grade and it's below base flood elevation, which is perfectly acceptable because there's no map, no regulations at the time. So the property owner wants to propose interior improvements. So that's no change to the footprint of the structure, just all interior. It's been determined that it's a proposed, the proposed improvements are considered a substantial improvement. So what really needs to happen to this structure to meet construction requirements? I'll put it out there if anybody wants to help answer this question, or if I can just keep going. All right, so what we want to do is we'll need to elevate. Because it's a substantial improvement, we need to get that lowest floor at or above that base flood elevation. So you need to extend the foundation up so that the lowest floor gets above that base flood elevation. And then you need to make sure that enclosure is compliant so that it's at grade on at least one side. It's only used for parking, access, or storage, has flood resistant materials, and it has those flood openings. In addition, you see the air conditioning unit was sitting below base flood elevation. That needs to be elevated up above that base flood elevation to help protect it. Right. So we talked before about the provisions for residential structures, but I didn't really go into non-residential structures. So non-residential structures are required either to elevate or it's at or above the base flood elevation, just like residential structures, or it must be dry flood proof so that the area of the building below the base flood elevation has to be dry flood proof, or essentially cannot let the water enter the building. So you have to use You have to retrofit doors to prevent that from happening. You also need a floodproofing design certificate, which is certified by an engineer. So in this case, the proposed substantial improvement is an interior improvement to an existing non-residential structure in Zone A. So it's been determined to be a substantial improvement. They chose to dry floodproof instead of elevating. So they just need to go through that process of providing the required documentation for that floodproofing. Peter?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, can this building be occupied then? I mean, doesn't it seem like if they're dry floodproofing, they can't open the doors during a flood. So does it have to be unoccupied, or is there any, do they speak to that at all?
Um, it does go into detail about what to do with the doors. You can put gates in the doors, but pretty much there has to be some kind of plan in place as to um, what needs to happen with the doors if there's an immediate or an imminent flood coming or potential for it to come. So there is a plan that has to be in place to address how to seal off those doors.
Okay.
Yeah, I worked on a project that in Lebanon that they're renovating a Kmart into a Target, and because it was considered a substantial improvement in doing so, they had to have this plan in place for how to seal off the doors in the case of a flood event.
Yeah, I just think about conflicts with the fire code and access and egress and all that during a flood.
Yeah, um,
But the plan should address all that.
the plan should address all that. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Another great resource, FEMA has a nice big resource about floodproofing non-residential structures, and I'm pretty sure that that would get all into it. I'm
Great.
just going to make a note of that as well. All right, great, thank you. All right. So manufactured homes, this is an existing manufactured home. It's has its floor below base foot elevation. Um, it's in an A zone. The proposed work includes improvements to the existing home and a lateral addition. So what needs to be done with this is because there's improvements being done to the original building and the addition has caused it to be a substantial improvement, both the existing and the addition would need to be elevated as if it was new construction. So it needs to be elevated above base foot elevation. It needs the anchoring needs to be attached to a permanent foundation, which it already was, but just lifted up. So that's an example of when you have improvements to the existing structure and the addition. So many homes in New Hampshire that are in the floodplain area were built with basements, which again, okay with at the time, no map, no floodplain regulations. It does become an issue when you want to substantially improve it or you have it suffer substantial damage. So this is an example of an existing A-zone structure, and they propose interior improvements. So what would need to happen for this home to be brought in compliance if it was substantially improved or substantially damaged? So the existing, as you can see, the lowest floor, this is below grade on all sides. It's considered a basement, which is considered the lowest floor of the structure. Your base floor elevation is up here. You have some utilities down here. So what needs to happen? It needs to be filled. You need to get the floor, or you need to fill up to at least grade. It can go higher, but it needs to be at least at grade because the existing next higher floor is above base flood elevation. The enclosure from the top of the fill to the bottom of that lowest floor can be considered an enclosure. It would need to meet the same requirements as we've talked about before. It would need to have the flood openings. It would need to be at grade. The floor of that enclosure needs to be at grade, at least on one side. It can only be used for parking, access, or storage. And that water heater or furnace then needs to be elevated up above that base flood elevation. This has happened in the past with other structures. Sometimes you don't have room in an existing structure, so sometimes they have to build an addition, a small addition to account for the utilities as well. I've spoken to people in the past that have wanted to do some improvements to their house, and they find out they have to fill their basement, and they sometimes change their mind after that and decide to do something else. All right. So this is another existing building in Zone A. It's slab on grade. Below base flood elevation is the lowest floor. They don't propose any improvements to the original building, but they propose to have a lateral addition. And there's going to be no structural modification made to the common wall or the roof. So what do they need to do? Because it's a substantial improvement, the lateral addition will need to be elevated as if it was new construction based on the current map and the current regulations. But because there was no improvement made on the existing one, and there's only essentially a doorway between these two, there's no modification, structural modification to the roof or the house. Only the addition needs to be elevated to that base flood elevation. And again, they have an enclosure that has flood openings and meets all those other requirements. So this is an example of an existing building in a Zone A. It was slab on grade. The proposed work includes a lateral addition and work on the original building, which does include a structural modification of the common wall or the roof. So the proposed work, which is the addition and the improvements to the original house, was determined to be a substantial improvement. So not only does the addition need to be elevated and brought into compliance as if new construction, but the existing structure does as well. It's because of those improvements made and because of that structural modification. All right, so now we'll move into a V zone. So again, these V zones are the ones that are elevated on post piers and columns. This is an existing residential building in a V zone. It's slab on grade. And the proposed work includes work on the original building, and they want to do a lateral addition. So this was considered a substantial improvement. This is what would need to happen to bring it into compliance. It would need to be brought up on post piers or columns to get above that base flood elevation. And the addition can be then added. So both the existing and the addition then need to be elevated to bring this into compliance. So now we have an existing residential structure in Zone VE. The proposed work includes work on the original building and a lateral addition, which are both considered a substantial improvement. So you can see this one is already on post piers or columns, but it is the lowest floor is still below base flood elevation. So what needs to happen? These are two options if someone wanted to do this. Bringing that whole house up further above that base flood elevation, whether the vertical addition is on top of the existing structure or below it. That is what needs to happen for it to be brought into compliance. All right, so another new construction residential in Zone VE. So this is new construction. So this is a new construction. So this is a little different than what we were talking about with existing buildings that were built prior to the maps. So all improvements, including additions or repairs to a new construction building, must be elevated to at least the height of the new construction building, regardless of the value of that work. And the work shall not, because the reason for this is because the work shall not compromise any of the NFIB requirements that the existing building was required to meet when it was initially built. So somebody has a new building or a new construction building that had been built in compliance. It was above base flood elevation. They want to put an addition onto that house. That addition has to meet the same requirements as that existing structure, regardless if it's a substantial improvement or not. It has to remain the same. If it didn't meet the same requirements, it would bring that whole structure out of compliance. So you don't want that. That's a case of that. And then one last building scenario. This is a new construction that was built to the base flood elevation that was in place at that time that it was built. Since that time, there's been a new map with a new base flood elevation. And now they want to add a lateral addition to that structure. There's no improvements proposed for the original building. They just want to add the addition. So what will need to happen is they will have to bring up that addition will need to now meet the new base flood elevation requirement and be elevated farther up than the existing building. The existing building does not need to meet that base flood elevation because there's no improvement. And also I forgot to highlight that there's no structural modification between these two buildings. It's just a doorway from one to the other. If there was a structural modification here, that existing building would also need to meet the new base flood elevation. So that's a lot. Shanti, question?
Yeah, so maybe I had it wrong then. So if the addition even doubled in cost relative to what the existing market value is, of the existing structure, you wouldn't have to do anything with the existing structure. Is that true? I thought that once you went beyond that 50% with the addition, now you'd have to raise the existing as well. But no, only if you're doing something in the existing. Is that what you're saying? So I could do a $2 million addition onto a $1 million home, and only the addition would need to meet the BFE requirement. Is that right?
Yeah, there's only two cases where that existing building would need to be brought up, is if there is improvements being done in that existing building or there's a structural modification onto the existing building, to the roof or the wall, that would require it to be
Raise the whole building at that point.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
So there is a table in that DES reference that I mentioned before, that FEMA substantial improvement, substantial damage. There's this table that has like all of these scenarios, and all of these pictures come from that DES reference. But there's a table that I used to always refer to because there's just so many factors that you have to think about to whether or not is it just the addition or is it the existing building? What needs to happen? And that table helped me a lot. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to look for that table. Maybe I'll send out the page number when I send out the resource for that table. And you can reference that when you have these situations.
Great. Thank you.
All right, great. All right, so administering the substantial improvement, substantial requirement requires local officials to perform essentially 6 major actions.
Hey, what if you could do me a favor?
It's
I know
review.
Dario already did
Oh, we got somebody off mute.
Dario out, and you could take me
All right. Review the application for substantial improvement determination, verify costs of the improvements and/or repairs, determine market value of the structure, make and issue the determination, require owners to obtain permits to bring that structure into compliance with the floodplain regulations, and maintain documentation. So I've mentioned this before. Well, actually, sorry. Just to start out. So it's very important to ensure that property owners in special flood hazard areas are aware of the substantial improvement and substantial damage requirements. A lot of times they may not even think about some of the things that they're doing, that they may not, well, hopefully they should know when they need to come and get a permit. Most of the times you see this issue more with substantial damage, because when buildings get damaged, property owners have a tendency to want to fix things right away. But that doesn't give the community enough time sometimes to look at the structure and see the amount of damage that's occurred before they start trying to fix things, try to clean things up. So they just need to be aware of those requirements. So it's also, I think I've mentioned this before already, important for communities to have process and procedures in place as far as determinations, just to make it a consistent and fair process throughout the community, and to make sure that that's transferable. If somebody was to leave, somebody can just easily come and pick that up. So some of the questions to consider when you're reviewing the permit application, again, is the proposed development in a special flood hazard area? Will the proposed development involve improving or repairing an existing building? Is the building an existing building or is it a new construction building? Because you have to think about the conditions for both of those. And yes, above, has the applicant provided you with the necessary information to make a determination? They really need to have those detailed descriptions of the proposed work and the associated costs in order for you to make that determination. Okay, so for step 2, verifying costs. Applicant submits the proposed costs. Some of the acceptable sources of cost information include itemized construction cost estimates prepared by a licensed contractor, building valuation tables, or other professional building cost estimating services. So it's really important just to compare the construction plans to the accompanying cost estimate to verify that those project costs are reasonable, are listed for each component of the improvement, and sometimes field verifying that the existing structure matches the proposed improvement plans, like just making sure the footprint size and orientation compare to the improvement plans. So little things like that. And just making sure, especially with damaged structures, that the proposed costs include all the work that's necessary to restore the structure to pre-damage condition. Sometimes property owners, for various reasons, will not want to repair it completely, but they really need to consider all that proposed work that's necessary to get it to that pre-damaged condition. Okay, so this is not an exhaustive list, and this is some of the items that are included in that FEMA desk reference. Materials and labor. So estimates of donated or discounted materials really need to be included, have to be included in the estimate, and there should be some estimated costs that go with it. You'll see this a lot of times after substantial damage. Charity organizations come in and offer labor to help people rebuild, but that labor cost needs to be accounted for into the costs. Sometimes you get people who are contractors themselves, who are the property owners, and they are going to do the work themselves. But regardless if they're going to pay themselves or not, those costs of that labor also need to be included, because not all of us are contractors and can rebuild houses, so it's a kind of a fairness issue as well. So another cost, site prep work, demolition and construction debris removal, exterior items can be included, interior finishes can be included, utility and service equipment, and then many more. Again, this is not exhaustive list. There is a longer list in that desk reference. Some costs to exclude: cleanup, trash removal, land surveying costs, costs to obtain plan specs, permit inspection fees, those costs to correct previously cited violations, outside improvements. This is strictly related to the substantial improvements. Substantial damage is strictly related to the structure, so nothing outside of the structure. And plug-in appliances. All right, so market value. This is always a good one. So the requirement is determine the market value of the structure, not including the land value, because again, we're only talking about the structure, before the start of construction of the improvement or the occurrence of damage. So market value refers to the price that a seller of real property can expect to receive from a buyer in a fair and open negotiation. Now that's what the guidance says in the desk reference. As you'll probably note, that market value is not defined in the floodplain ordinance. It is not one of the definitions. So you really have to go to the FEMA guidance to really understand that. So for substantial improvement, substantial damage determinations only, okay, I talked about that, sorry. So acceptable sources of cost information include the assessed value of the structure, or property professional appraisals by a professional appraisal. Most communities in New Hampshire do use the assessed value of the structure as the market value. That has worked the best for all communities so far. There are cases where I've helped communities who have had property owners that did not agree with the assessed value of the structure. And at that time, the community can allow that property owner to get a property professional appraisal done, and submit that to the community. The community can review it and determine if they'll accept that. I can say that one professional appraisal that I reviewed did look better on paper, but it included some accessory structures as part of the appraisal, and that needed to be excluded. Right. So step 4, making that substantial improvement determination. So it's simply a formula of the cost of improvement divided by the pre-improvement market value of the structure will get you the % improvement. This is an example of a $250,000 market value of a structure. The cost of improvement, $155,000. It results in a 62%. So that would not be considered a substantial improvement. FEMA does provide guidance that anytime you're between 40 and 60%, that maybe you need more detailed information to make sure that the determination is as accurate as possible, because when it falls in between that place, it could be a little bit more questionable. So the more information, the better, when you're in between those two percentages. Same with substantial damage, the same type of formula as the cost of repairs over the pre-damage market value of the structure equals the % damage. So this one comes in at 40%. Maybe if it's 45%, that's where you may want to really start looking at it. It just depends on if you feel like you have the right enough information about the cost value or feel the market value is adequate. So also in step 4, it's issuing that determination to the property owner. That's important not only to have for your records, but also for information for the property owner to have on file. It's also important if it's not a substantial improvement or not a substantial damage to also issue that letter, not just when it is a substantial improvement, substantial damage. So there's different various sample letters that are in that DES reference that can be used to help create those letters. So the property owner may appeal the substantial improvement, substantial damage determination on the basis of the cost, an appropriate valuation of the cost, an appropriate method of the determination of market value building. But this would, if this is a determination by the building official, it'd be the same as any other appeal. Who would go to the zoning board of adjustments for that. All right, so step 5, this is the part where they've been determined to be a substantial improvement or substantial damage. Now you must work towards making sure that the improvements, whether it's the existing building or the addition or both or either, need to meet those requirements. Obviously, you need a permit. Any development in a special flood hazard area requires a permit. So we've referenced before, lowest floor above that base flood elevation, no basements, enclosure requirements are met, utilities are protected or elevated, and the use of flood damage resistant materials. So there are several solutions that can achieve compliance based on the, and how they're selected is kind of based on the given structure and several factors such what flood zone it's in, the type of foundation, the feasibility, and whether or not the structure is a residential or non-residential structure. So you can elevate in place, which means if it's on a foundation wall in a zone A, as you can see from the building scenarios, it's just elevating up that foundation. In some cases, if you have a 2-story and you decide to abandon the ground level for living purposes and move any utilities up to the upper floor and make that lower enclosure meet the enclosure requirements of having flood openings and being at grade. That's one scenario. Extending those foundation walls upward, converting a walkout basement to a compliant enclosure. I worked for over a year with a resident in Merrimack after the 2007 flood. Had an existing building that was substantially damaged. They needed to make sure that that lowest floor was above base flood elevation. So they decided to convert that walkout basement from a recreation room into an enclosure that was only used for parking access or storage. So that worked for them. They did have to build off a new room off the upper floor to account for the utilities that were in that area. And then again, we talked about the dry flood proofing for non-residential structures. So when a proposed work is not a substantial improvement or not a substantial damage, it does not need to meet the requirements as if it was new construction. There is still permitting requirements. It's still development in the special flood hazard area, and then all other federal and state permits that may be needed would need to be received for that improvement or not improvement. Certainly, if they're doing something to the house, it's always good to recommend that they do a little something that could help them out, especially if it's an existing building that has an increased flood risk. Even just looking at elevating maybe the air conditioning unit up can also help out in the end, or making anything that's below that base flood elevation with flood resistant materials is also helpful as well. All right, off to step 6 is maintaining documentation. As a participating community of the National Flood Insurance Program, communities are required to keep all records on file anyways, but important to maintain for these cases, permit applications, the documentation of your determinations, how you calculated it, the official determination letter to the property owner. If you have a historic structure, making sure that you have that documentation on place that allows that exemption to happen. The as-built elevation data or the elevation certificate, variance proceedings, any other documentation or certifications that are needed. All right, so I've got another poll. Sorry, Kim. Let's see, this going. All right, so that should be in your chat, except for Kim's chat, unfortunately. So which item is not a cost to include for substantial improvement, substantial damage determination? I know I'm going a little hard on this one because because I went through that list kind of fast, so but it looks like everyone was caught on to what I was talking about with the fact that land surveying costs are not included in a substantial improvement, substantial damage determination. So great job. Okay. Okay, so we're at almost 3:15, so I'm going to be just starting to go into some of the resources that are available. Again, I mentioned these 2 resources in the beginning. These are the 2 key resources you should have if you deal with substantial improvement, substantial damage. They are available online. I'm not sure if you can still order them, hard copies, but they're definitely online and available and will be in your resource page that I send tomorrow. Okay, so just to highlight a little bit on substantial improvement, substantial damage. So I'm not sure how many of you have had the experience of having multiple structures damaged as a result of event. If you're around during the 2006, 2007 floods, there was a lot of damage as a result of the flooding back then. That was early in my career, and I was helping a lot of property owners and community officials trying to understand the substantial damage requirements and what needed to happen. And that's a whole other training that I'll talk about that I will be doing somewhat soon. But I just wanted to highlight this FEMA substantial damage estimator tool. I can't say that I know of any community that was using this at the time we had the last big event in 2006, 2007. We haven't had a lot of large amount of structural damage as a result since then. This is really geared towards when you have a lot of determinations to be made. It's to assist in making those determinations and making sure it's done in a consistent, formal, and organized manner. It assists with on-site rapid visual inspections to estimate repair costs and building values. So you can see on the right here, that's an example of kind of what's involved. There is a lot of pre-population that is involved in getting this up and going, but it could be a very useful tool. And FEMA does have some great YouTube videos. These are the series of modules that are available, and I'll include the link to this, that will kind of walk you through that process of setting up that tool. So just wanted to highlight that as a resource that's out there. Also in 2020, there was this building code and floodplain administration and enforcement policy. So following a disaster declarations, communities may apply for public assistance funds to administer and enforce building codes and their floodplain ordinance following this major disaster declaration. It's meant to help assist local floodplain administrators or building officials in making determinations. Some examples of eligible work including conducting field surveys, establishing damage trends, preparing cost information, hiring training staff, collecting field data, many more things. It is limited to 180 days after disaster declaration. I don't believe that we've ever had this yet because, again, we haven't had that level of structural damage like Vermont does. I do believe that they tried to access this. And I am definitely not the expert, and I think there's our friends at Homeland Security and Emergency Management are the ones that can really assist with answering any questions regarding this policy. But and I think some were just going to be on the call here today. But again, just wanted to highlight it as something that's out there. Another resource is, especially regarding substantial damage, is this increased cost of compliance coverage. This is a coverage in a standard flood insurance policy. So if a structure is determined by the community to be substantially damaged, policy holders can take the letter that they get from their community official and give it to their insurance company, and they can then access up to $30,000 to cover structure elevation, or if they want to demolish and rebuild, move the house to higher ground, or floodproof it if it's a non-residential structure. That amount is out there. I agree, $30,000 is really not that much to do with a structure to bring it into compliance with the floodplain ordinance. That has been in place for decades. There's talk about reforming in Congress of increasing that amount. I think the last I heard, 150,000, which would really help people. But it's still at $30,000 right now. The damage, unlike the substantial damage determination of any origin, this determination has to be done as a result of a flood, because it's related to flood insurance. So again, that's something that's available to property owners who have a flood insurance policy. And there was a lot of property owners that I helped out in 2006, 2007 with this process of moving that forward. So, all right, some best practices, just ensuring that determinations are consistent and fair. Again, using written procedures that meet the requirements and provide guidance, using the same methods for market value and improvement estimates community-wide, implementing procedures on a consistent basis to make those fair and defensible determinations, and document decisions and maintaining all records in a community file. So a couple of years ago, I put together a guidance and best practices for an effective local floodplain management program. And then to accompany that, I also put together administrative procedures for managing floodplain development template, so that communities could just take this template and kind of fill in the blanks and customize it for a community. So this is administrative procedures is a key tool in ensuring a community fulfills its responsibilities and to remain in good standing in the National Flood Insurance Program. Again, just harping on the same thing, is to ensure community adherence and consistency for all properties, to ensure structures are built in compliance. And recognizing that the number and ability and expertise of all community staff responsible for administering and enforcing local floodplain regulations varies throughout the state. It still comes down to the community to have that responsibility of administering and enforcing those regulations. So the sections of that template cover what are those responsibilities of the floodplain administrator, how does the community make determinations of whether a structure is in the floodplain or not, what happens if it straddles the zone, what if a corner of it touches the zone, what are the situations and what are the outcomes with those situations. What's the process for floodplain permits? What's the process for determinations? And what is the process if you have a violation and need to enforce it? And what is the process with floodplain records? Also, a few years ago, I put together an application packet and property owner guide for substantial improvement, substantial damage. This is still available on the Office of Planning and Development's website, which I'll link in the resource page. Ensures the applicants submit the necessary information for communities to make that determination. Helps communicate information about substantial improvements to applicants and be consistent with all applicants. So that property guide goes through a lot of detail, provides information to the property owners of what exactly is this process that they need to go through so that their expectations are clear on what they need to do. Makes it easier to document determination and retain documentation in community records, which is part of that application packet, which includes a checklist, the application form, and a sheet that includes the cost estimate for reconstruction or improvement. The property owner guide is essentially a template so communities can customize it. And there's an application requirement checklist so that applicants know what their responsibility is and what they need to do. So lastly, I have a grant through NOAA to work on a project. It's called the Prepare Project. It's preparing for resilient and equitable post-disaster assistance and recovery to events. It is specific to the 17 coastal communities, but I'm hoping that what I put together for this project would be applicable to the rest of the communities in the state. And my major task, there's more to this project than just what I'm going to be talking about. So if you want more information, happy to talk more about it. But my major task for under this project is developing a substantial damage plan template for communities to use. Since substantial improvement and substantial damage are so intertwined, there will be references to substantial improvement in it. But it's mainly for kind of a guide for communities to develop, to kind of walk you through the process of what you need to do when you have substantial, especially when you have multiple structures that have been substantially damaged. Again, we haven't seen that in since 2007. We've gotten lucky with Superstorm Sandy, with Tropical Storm Irene, the flood events that Vermont just recently had. So my worry as the floodplain coordinator and continues today is that when is our next big storm coming? So this Prepare project is kind of preparing everybody to get ready for that. So this substantial damage plan is a way to help with that. If your community is in the community rating system, there are points that are available for communities to have a substantial damage plan. So that's there as well. Another task I'll be doing is developing a substantial damage training program. And this is going to be built so that, not just me, but other entities could deploy this type of training program, ideally to do it every year to keep it fresh in everybody's head. So stay tuned on that. And I will be holding a substantial damage training as part of this project, and I'll be sure to get the word out about that once that's set up. And lastly, it's developing a framework for a regional substantial damage team for the coastal communities. We're a small coastal region with 17 communities. So we're looking at trying to figure out how we can address, kind of share resources and capacity with a regional team. Can a septic system be located below base fill elevation? Yes, it can. I worked a lot with the town of Goffstown that had a very low neighborhood and they had a lot of septic systems, and the water table was so high they had to mound put fill as part of the septic system. And unfortunately, that resulted in this neighborhood was also in the floodway. So if you're familiar with the floodway requirements, putting fill in takes a lot of different steps, but yes. All right. So just wrapping up, here is Stephanie and Sarah's contact information at the Office of Planning and Development. They are the contacts for the floodplain management program there. And this is my contact information. I do work closely with Stephanie and Sarah, but again, I'm with the coastal program and specifically mostly work with coastal communities, but do help out when I can with Office of Planning and Development. So with that, I am done with presenting. So if we have more questions or you have comments or want to add anything to what I presented today, we have 4 more minutes. Happy to hear from you all.
Jennifer, I have a question.
Yes. Hi, Dara.
How you doing? Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So what would be the best initial website page to go look at in generically if building inspectors and the like have floodplain questions or need resources? Like, what's the front door?
Yep. The Office of Planning and Development Floodplain Management Program would be the best place to start because that's where all of the resources that we kind of developed are located.
Okay, so I'm on the main website for Office Planning.
I'll get you the website.
Where's the flood?
Oh, Sarah got there.
Floodplain management. Okay, see it. What we offer. Okay. Floodplain
Yep.
management assistance. Okay, super.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Just so people know what I put in chat, I put a link to the main homepage for our floodplain management program, as well as a link for the resources section. So hopefully both of those, you should be able to find what you're looking for.
Thank you.
All right. Any last questions or anything else that anybody has? All right. If there's no further questions, I'll hang out here for a couple more minutes. But if you're good to go, if you're free to log off and enjoy the rest of your day. So thank you everyone for attending. I'll be following up tomorrow with the resources, slides, and a quick feedback survey. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Take care.
Thanks, Peter.